Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a pretty complex but super relevant topic, postmodernism.
Yeah, postmodernism.
And to guide us through this, we're going to be using Conrad Reicher's book, Postmodernity, Disease or Cure. Have you had a chance to look at this one yet?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating read. Riker really gets into how this whole way of thinking is impacting men in particular.
And that's what we really want to dig into today.
Right.
Like, how does this postmodernism thing actually play out in our lives as men? Especially when we're talking about relationships and those unspoken
You
expectations.
hit the nail on the head, those covert contracts, as we call them in the red pill community.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is postmodernism? I mean, I've heard the term thrown around a lot, but it still feels kind of slippery.
It is slippery. That's part of the point, really.
Right.
See, postmodernism challenges those big overarching stories, those grand narratives that we used to rely on to understand the world.
And narrative.
Yeah, think about those traditional ideas of success, get a good job, get married, provide for your family, that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah. Classic man up stuff.
Right, exactly. Those are grand narratives. And postmodernism comes along and says, hold on, who says those are the only ways to be successful or fulfilled? What about individual choice and different paths? It throws a wrench in the whole system.
So it's like questioning everything.
Pretty much. And that can be unsettling, especially for men who are raised with those traditional expectations.
I can see that. It's like if you take away those grand narratives, you're left with, well, what?
Right. It creates this sense of uncertainty and instability. And that's where those covert contracts we talked about come in.
Okay, so how does postmodernism mess with those unspoken expectations in relationships?
Well, if there's no longer a clear consensus on those traditional roles and responsibilities, things get murky.
Makes sense. It's like if the rules of the game are constantly changing, how do you know how to play?
Exactly. And Riker actually uses a really interesting example to illustrate how this works. He talks about Derrida, who's this key postmodern thinker.
Okay, I've heard of Derrida. What's the example?
So Derrida was all about deconstructing things.
Sure.
And he even applied that to his own signature.
Constructing his signature.
Yeah.
How do you even do that?
He argued that even something as personal and unique as your signature isn't fixed in meaning. It changes depending on the context.
All right, I'm following. So like my signature on a check means something different than my signature on a birthday card.
Exactly. The meaning shifts based on who's reading it and why. It's all about interpretation.
So it's like postmodernism is saying there's no one right way to interpret anything.
You got it. And that includes things like masculinity. There's no single fixed definition of what it means to be a man, then those traditional roles and expectations start to break down.
And that's where things get tricky for men trying to navigate relationships right.
Big time. Because it's not just about individual interpretation anymore. It's also about how those interpretations clash with each other. And that can lead to a whole lot of conflict.
I bet. So this whole postmodernism thing, it's not exactly a new phenomenon, right? Didn't it kind of grow out of earlier philosophical movements?
Absolutely. It's got roots that go way back. But one of the key turning points was this group of thinkers who started questioning the Enlightenment.
With the Enlightenment?
Yeah.
Wasn't that all about reason and logic?
Yeah.
How does that lead to something as well slippery as postmodernism?
It's all about pushing ideas to their limits. You see, those Enlightenment thinkers, they came up with some groundbreaking concepts, but there were also some contradictions hidden within those ideas. And that's what the postmodernists seized on.
Okay, give me an example. I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
We'll take Kant's idea of a universal moral law. He said that reason helps us figure out this moral code that applies to everyone. But if reason is subjective and individual, how can it lead to a universal law that's supposed to be objective? It's kind of a paradox.
Ah, I see. So they were basically pointing out the flaws in the Enlightenment project.
Exactly. They said, hey, if there's no objective truth, then everything is up for grabs. And that includes the power structures that have defined society for centuries, including the ones that tell us what it means to be a man, what a marriage should look like, how we should raise our kids, all of it.
So we've got this historical backdrop of questioning everything, combined with this idea that there's no single truth or right way of doing things. And that's happening at the same time that we have the rise of social justice movements that are also challenging those traditional roles. It's like a perfect storm, right?
It is, and that storm is hitting men particularly hard because it's challenging those very structures that have defined their identities and roles in society for so long.
Where do we go from here? How do we even begin to make sense of all this and figure out how to navigate this new landscape?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's what we're going to explore next. We'll dive into how this postmodern shift is playing out in specific areas of men's lives and how those covert contracts in relationships are being renegotiated whether we realize it or not.
Okay, so we've talked about how postmodernism shakes things up. But how does this actually play out in real life for men? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Well, one area where you see this playing out is in the media. The way men are portrayed in movies, TV shows, you name it, has shifted dramatically in recent years.
Yeah, it's like this strong, silent type is
Yeah.
out and the sensitive, emotionally available guy is in. But is that really authentic, or is it just another box men are supposed to fit into?
That's a great question, and Richter points out this shift can be really confusing for men because it creates a sense of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like if you embrace those traditional masculine traits, you risk being labeled as toxic or insensitive.
Right. But if you overcorrect and try too hard to be the new man, you might come across as inauthentic, or even worse, weak.
Exactly. It's like this narrow tightrope you're supposed to walk, and it's easy to fall off on either side.
So no wonder a lot of guys are feeling lost.
Absolutely. And this ties back into what we were talking about earlier with those covert contracts in relationships. Modernism has blurred the lines of those traditional roles, which can create a lot of tension if those expectations aren't openly discussed.
Okay, so let's talk about those covert contracts. Can you give us some examples of how they're being challenged?
Sure. One example Riker uses is housework and childcare. Traditionally, those were seen as the woman's domain.
Right, the whole barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen stereotype.
Exactly. But with more women entering the workforce, those expectations have shifted. But a lot of those unspoken assumptions haven't caught up.
Right, it's like you've got this clash between those old school ideas about who does what at home and the reality of modern life where both partners are often working full time.
Exactly. And that's a recipe for conflict, for sure.
Yeah, if those expectations aren't made explicit and renegotiated, it can lead to resentment building up on both sides.
Absolutely. And that's why Riker really stresses the importance of communication. Open and honest communication is key to navigating this new landscape.
It's not about trying to force things back to the way they were right. It's about acknowledging that the old rules no longer apply.
Precisely. It's about figuring out what a new equitable arrangement looks like for both partners.
And that probably requires a lot of tough conversation.
It does, but it's worth it. Because the alternative is just letting that resentment fester.
This makes me think about another area where those covert contracts are being challenged. Emotional labor.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Right.
Traditionally, women were expected to be the emotional caretakers in relationships.
Right, the ones who always have to be nurturing and understanding.
Exactly. But now there's this expectation for men to be more emotionally available too.
Which can be a good thing, right? And men have feelings too.
Absolutely. But it also raises some tricky questions, like how much emotional labor are men expected to do, and are they even equipped to handle it?
That's a good point. Because men and women often express emotions differently, right?
They do, and Riker acknowledges that. But he also says that men shouldn't use that as an excuse to shut down emotionally, or to avoid taking responsibility for their feelings.
It's about finding that balance.
Exactly. Being in touch with your emotions, but not being overwhelmed by them. Being able to communicate them effectively, but not necessarily becoming a stereotypical, sensitive...
It's about being authentic to yourself.
Exactly. And that ties into one of Riker's key points. Men need to reclaim their agency in this new landscape.
What does that mean exactly?
It means not just passively accepting whatever rules or expectations society throws at them. It means actively defining for themselves what it means to be a man in the 21st century.
Okay, that sounds empowering, but also kind of daunting. I mean, if there's no clear roadmap, how do you even begin to do that?
That's where Riker's book offers some real guidance. He doesn't just leave men feeling lost and confused. He actually lays out some practical steps they can take to reclaim their agency and navigate this postmodern world effectively.
Okay, so let's dive into those solutions. I think our listeners are eager to hear what Riker has to offer. So we've talked about the challenges of postmodernism, but what about solutions? What does Riker suggest men actually do about all this?
Well, one thing he really emphasizes is the importance of community. Men need to build strong communities to counter that sense of isolation that's so prevalent these days.
Yeah, I can see that. The Bread Pill community is a good example, right? It's a place where men can come together and support each other.
Exactly. It's about finding those spaces, whether online or in person, where you can connect with like-minded guys and share your experiences.
So it's not just about complaining and commiserating, right? There's got to be a more proactive element to it.
Absolutely. It's about rediscovering those traditional values that have been kind of pushed aside lately. Things like honor, courage, self-reliance. Those are the building blocks of strong men and strong community.
It's like tapping into that inner strength that's always been there, but maybe got buried under all the noise.
Exactly. And those communities can provide that support and accountability you need to actually live out those values.
Right. It's like having a group of workout buddies. You're more likely to stick to your fitness goals if you've got people pushing you.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's the same with these values. You need that support system to help you stay on track.
So it's about finding your tribe, those guys who get it, who understand the challenges you're facing.
Yeah, and who can help you become the best version of yourself.
And it's not just about personal growth either, right? Riker also talks about men being leaders.
Absolutely. Men need to step up and be leaders in their families, their communities. The world needs strong male leadership now more than ever.
But doesn't that kind of go against the whole postmodern idea of rejecting those fixed roles and expectations?
It's not about going back to those old rigid models of leadership. It's about recognizing that men have a unique contribution to make. It's about using your strength, your protectiveness, your ability to think strategically to make a positive impact.
So it's not about fitting into a specific box. It's about using your strengths to lead in your own way.
Exactly. It's about forging your own path, defining for yourself what it means to be a man in the 21st century.
And that's not always easy, but it's definitely worth striving for.
Absolutely. It's the only way to truly reclaim your agency and live a fulfilling life.
This has been a really insightful conversation. I think we've covered a lot of ground, from the challenges of postmodernism to some potential solutions.
And if anyone listening wants to delve deeper into these ideas, I highly recommend checking out Conrad Reicher's book, Postmodernity, Disease or Cure.
Yeah, it's a great resource for anyone who wants to understand this stuff better and figure out how to navigate this crazy world we live in.
You can find it on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. Definitely worth a read.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and empowering. Until next time, keep questioning, keep growing, and keep forging your own path.